Hey, WoWsauce! It's Never, and we're going to talk today about common fallacies in WoW. Now, I know fallacies, you might be thinking of a song in your head, but what I'm going to talk about is logical fallacies that a lot of us fall prey to in World of Warcraft and some examples of them and why they're stupid and we shouldn't get caught up in them. You can learn a lot about these sort of things just by going on Wikipedia or going to yourfallacyis.com. There's a really good poster there that gives a good example of a lot of these. So the first thing I want to talk about is something called false cause, and that's presuming that a real or perceived relationship between things means that one causes the other. For example, doing this sort of thing makes the loot spawn more. Or there are a lot of crazy things where people said, well, if everybody's got this exact level of resist gear, then the boss drops more loot or something like that, or this legendary has a greater chance to spawn. And while there could be examples of things like that in the game, the real likely thing is that it isn't. You're just falling prey to this sort of fallacy. Another example is the Talisman of True Treasure tracking, which I have actually known people that believed it made a difference. And it's just not a measurable enough thing to really tell. The next one is called a slippery slope, and that's presuming that if we allow something to happen, then something else will happen as a result, and therefore we should not allow the first thing to happen. And this kind of falls into something where everyone's an armchair game designer. So if we allow players to do such and such, then they're always going to do this as a result, and so we shouldn't allow that. And it's 2 degrees of separation that you shouldn't have. Just because players can do something doesn't mean they always will. And it's one of the things where I think Blizzard takes a lot of risks in this. There's a lot of stuff that they could make this assumption with, but they try it anyway because making an assumption doesn't mean it's true. So a slippery slope it's a tricky one to work around, but I think that a lot of cases you can get stuck worrying about what might happen, or you can just try it out and see what really does happen. And there have been a lot of cases where we tried something and it worked really well, or where we thought something would work and it turned out to be really crappy. I mean, look at the Garrison. It looked really cool on paper, and then it just didn't work at all because we couldn't predict all the things that happened. But I'm honestly glad they tried. So the next one is personal incredulity. This is assuming that because something is difficult for you to understand, it isn't true. And this is one that people have a real hard time with because it's really kind of a personal thing to deal with. A good example of this is anything to do with game design or like mythic ratings difficulty. A lot of people think, well, the mythic rating, it's not really that hard because I don't really get the fights, and admitting this to yourself is a tricky one because you have to be very objective about your own points of view to really see this one. The next one is probably the most well-known one of these, which is the gambler's fallacy, which is assuming that past events will influence future ones when there really isn't any reason for it. And so I'm just going to lay down the law with this one. Let's say you're trying to get Death Charger to drop. If I remember correctly, Death Charger is about a 1 in 100 chance to drop right now. It used to be like 1 in 5,000. Anyway, the expectation is that, well, it's a 1 in 100 chance, so if you run Stratholme 100 times, you're absolutely going to get the mount because it's due. And the fact is that you won't. The 100th time you run it, you had the same chance of getting it as you did the first time you ran it. And you can go all around in circles trying to find ways that that's not true, but the fact is every time you run that, the game rolls the same 100-sided die, as it were, and the past does not influence the roll you're doing right now, and it never will. This applies to every RNG element in the whole game, unless there's a specific mechanic included in the game that is meant to calculate up how many times you've done something and adjust the probability according to it. Every time you do it, it's the same chance. So you can't store up your chances until you finally have a certainty to get it. You can even take and look at the number of tries over a set in time, and it'll appear like it's due. Like, okay, now I've got a really good chance of it happening, but it just simply isn't. It's the same chance no matter what. Now, some people are going to try and disprove this. They're going to put comments in and say, "Here's the math that proves you're wrong." Go ahead, but keep doing some research and you'll find that it's really the same every time. The next one is bandwagoning. This is another one you've probably heard of, and that's assuming that something is true because it's popular or appears to be popular. And this really applies to every opinion ever. So just because a lot of people on certain forums will say the game is really bad right now, suddenly we start thinking that the game is really bad right now. And so what do? We start behaving like the game is really bad right now, when in fact it's perfectly possible to have a lot of fun in the game right now. This is one of the most damaging things to the opinion of the game, is there are things in the game that suck right now. Don't get me wrong. But just because everyone says that they suck doesn't mean that they have to suck for you. There are quite a few parts in the game or pieces of the game's history where people have been really unhappy. I've had a good time. I mean, even during Warlords of Draenor, I've had a good time. Just because the vocal minority or even the vocal majority, just because they don't like things doesn't mean you don't have to. Think for yourself and decide what you think, and forget about them. So the next one is the appeal to authority, and that's assuming that because someone perceived as an authority figure says or believes something, it must be true. Now, this is where I come real clean with this. YouTubers don't know crap. I mean, let's face it. I'm just telling you the best of my understanding. I'm telling you how I see it based on the information I have and my ability to deduce and work with that information. So, also, this is like it applies to disregarding an actual authority figure in favor of the perceived ones. And so that's like going around and trusting what the YouTubers say and not trusting the actual game devs. Because the devs, they do this all the time. And a lot of people think, they start thinking in these insane ways where they think, well, if somebody were to just sit down with the game and look it over and figure out what's wrong and then come up with ways to fix it, it would be fine. I mean, what do you think the game devs do at work all day long? What do you think they're really there to do? That is exactly what they do. And they're not just, people like us who don't really know what we're doing. They're people that have been doing this for years. They're in some cases some of the best people in the industry doing this. And it's easy to assume that they don't know what they're doing because we don't fully understand what it means for them to do. And that's where personal incredulity comes in with this again, is we don't really understand game design. Not really. Some of you out there might, and you might have very good, valid arguments against what Blizzard does, but that doesn't mean you understand everything about their situation or what they're doing. And you put those two together, that's why people don't trust the devs, is because of these fallacies here. Is because they assume that if they don't understand it, that isn't the way it is, and they assume that the authority figures they do understand are more believable than the ones they don't. The next one is composition and division. And this is assuming that what is true about one part of something must be true of the other parts. So, for example, you'll see a lot of raid leaders fall into this trap where, because a particular boss strategy calls for doing a fight a certain way, that a similar one will have to work exactly the same way, or that all healing classes generally work the same. It's assuming that things are more similar to one another than they really are, and this fallacy causes us to see more class homogenization than there actually is. It's a tricky one to really explain, but you can see it once in a while. The next one is called just a genetic fallacy, and that's judging something by its origin in favor of its contents. So if you hear, oh well, my friend went to Icy Veins to find out how to play his class and it just didn't really work well for him, and then the fallacy would be assuming that, well, Icy Veins is not reliable, and you distrust it completely. Even though maybe it's just that person's inability to understand what was told them about that one spec, or maybe their information about that spec is wrong, but everything else is right. The sad fact of it is, you really just have to do your own research and verify things yourself if you want to really know if they're right. You could even apply that to Noxic. I mean, once in a while, Noxic's got to get some information right. I mean, even a broken watch is right twice a day. The next one is the black or white fallacy. And honestly, this applies to every single thing in life. When two opposite states are considered to be the only possible options, you'll see that a lot if you hear anything about politics. It's either Republicans or Democrats, and most people out there assume that it's one or the other, and that there are no other options. So the fact of the matter is, there are many other options. That doesn't mean they're good, but they're there. LFR is a good example of this. LFR is either something that we need because it caters to the casuals and they have to have some raiding experience, or it's something that's bad because they don't need a raiding experience. And we assume that we either need to have LFR or we don't. But few people explore something in the middle, which might actually be a better solution. Nothing in life is really that binary. Everything has shades of gray in it. The next one is the anecdotal fallacy, and that is where you rely on a personal experience or an isolated incident instead of on actual arguments or real data about something. This applies to a lot of stuff. A good example is, I went to Ashran once and it sucked, therefore Ashran always and completely sucks. Whereas maybe you just had a bad experience with Ashran and you really should give it a better look. We assume that our one example or our limited point of view is representative of the whole. And this is one that people do constantly. They fall into this all the time. Ugh, there's something in my eye. You play Warlords of Draenor and you get up to max level, and then you go and you run a dungeon or two and you don't have the experience you thought you would. And so then you assume, well, this expansion's terrible. And I would expect that this is the number one cause of people actually leaving the game, is fallacies like this, but specifically this one, is they assume that their limited experience is representative of every experience they could have. And it's a real shame because there's a lot of fun to have out there. Finally, the last one I'm going to talk about is something called middle ground. And that's assuming that the compromise between the two extremes, like the black or white, the compromise between them must be the truth. And so for the people that don't just buy into the Republican or Democrat or Horde or Alliance type of thing, we assume that, well, the right answer is somewhere exactly in the middle. And there's really no sense or reason to that at all. The right thing is the right thing. The truth is the truth no matter where you find it. Just because you have two extremes that are wrong doesn't mean the truth has to be exactly in the center of them. The truth is usually something entirely alien to the both of them in the first place. An example is, vanilla WoW was when WoW was the best. No, it wasn't, because it had X problems, and so current WoW is when WoW was best. No, it wasn't, it's because vanilla was better. So a lot of people just assume, well, it has to be somewhere in the middle. Where is that? It's Wrath of the Lich King. So in the end, my purpose in talking about this isn't to sway anyone else to my point of view, and my representation of these concepts isn't by any means comprehensive, or in some cases it's not even perfectly applicable. But I wanted to bring this up so that we could all be a little more aware of how these sort of things affect the way we think and affect the way we perceive others to think. And maybe my hope is, by looking at this from a more objective point of view, we can improve the community a little bit, and we can hopefully feel better about the decisions that we do make in the game. We can like it because we like it, and we can dislike it or want it to be better because we really do, and not because of any of these other reasons. I find that the more objective I look at things, the more I enjoy what I'm doing when I play, and I hope that that can convey over to the rest of you, and you can get more out of the time you do spend playing. Okay, thanks, bye.